Teofimo Lopez strikes me as an elite innovator, creative, adaptive, and sharper than people give him credit for in-ring problem solving. While Shakur Stevenson feels like a rare blend of Andre Ward's control and grit with Floyd Mayweather's precision and defensive mastery. Together, it's intellect versus intellect. Teo's explosive invention against Shakur's calm, surgical dominance. The truth about Shakur Stevenson and Teofimo Lopez. So let's begin with the press conference. What is the purpose of a press conference? Clearly, one of the main purposes of a press conference is to market the fight. It's marketing. It's marketing a product. The product is the pay-per-view or attending ringside. But it also can give us some clues into the psychological makeup of each fighter. So let's start with the press conferences and then let's build to more things such as the styles, the resumes, etc. So the first press conference, which was on the 10th of December 2025 at Madison Square Garden. Now let's look at the Shakur perspective. So he claimed he wanted the biggest challenge. So what does that mean? If you say you want the biggest challenge, then effectively you're saying Teo is a significant challenge and he wants to prove that he's elite. This, to me, shows a boxer that wants to get to the top of the mountain. And from Teo's perspective, he stated, or he presented confidence. He presented a lot of confidence. And that was about it. It was, there was no significant exchanges, and both fighters collaboratively acknowledged the magnitude of the event. Then you had the second press conference, which happened on January the 14th, 2026, again at Madison Square Garden. This was a little bit more tense as Stevenson proclaimed that Teo is not on his level. So imagine there's levels to boxing, as they say. There's levels to everything. And, if Teo's here, then Shakur is here. And he's saying that he being Shakur, is coming to show superiority. He says he sees everything he does. In a sense, I guess the byproduct of that is that if you see everything your opponent does, then how can your opponent surprise you? He also stated that he studied him. That would indicate that he's taking the fight very seriously, that Shakur's taking it very seriously. And Shakur also stated that this is easy work for me. Teo, again, expressed confidence, says each fight represents a different version to him that represents his versatility, which I think is an accurate statement, and his innovation. And he says he thrives in moments like this. And he states that you can't prepare for someone like me. Sounds good, but is it true? I guess in a sense, because Teo is an innovative fighter, I think there's some truth in that sentiment. It's not a nonsensical sentiment. And he says, I'm comfortable right here. And that's probably alluding to the magnitude of the event. He's comfortable under the bright lights, figuratively speaking. And here we had the live face-off, which was tense. Before we move to the latest face-off, I think it's important to ponder some questions. Like, do press conferences matter? Do they matter in determining the outcome of a fight? Can you score a psychological victory? Or can you do something in a press conference to help your performance? And then you can ask which press conference matters. Is the first one more important than the second one, than the third one, etc.? I guess, in a sense, the more you observe the enemy, the more you feel their energy. The more you observe the enemy, the more you feel their energy. And then there was the latest press conference in January 29th, 2026. And there was a lot of profanity, a lot of D words, B words, N words. It was, lots of profanity, a lot of tension. This is what I observed. I felt Shakur seemed frustrated. There was a composure to him, but there was a bit of aggression. While Teo is just saying some really random stuff. Here's another observation. Is that a byproduct of his personality, or is it an unorthodox strategy to take control? You can see that from press conference 1 to press conference 3, it was quite passive in press conference 1. But now we're getting to an emotional space, a very emotional space. and the fighters are becoming more emotive. There's more aggression. There's passion. I guess you can say that the aggression or the willingness to win, the passion to win, the byproduct of that is, being aggressive. Of course, people express passion in different ways, but you can feel that it's tense. And like I said, the difference between press conference 1 and press conference 3 is night and day. So there's definitely something happening here. But is there a psychological advantage? I think that all depends on perspective. So let's talk about the resumes. Let's talk about the resumes of Shakur versus Teo. And here's a question. Are resumes important? The premise here is that resumes are important. Your CV is important. Let me explain by looking at some historical context. When Evander Holyfield, a legendary fighter, fought Mike Tyson, another legendary fighter, you had Evander, undisputed heavyweight champion, undisputed cruiserweight champion, versus Tyson, who was an undisputed heavyweight champion and a champion at the time. These were great fighters that had great resumes. They had had great elite achievements. They had built great brands. Tyson with his psychological and physical dominance and destruction, and Evander Holyfield as a total warrior, a man who never quits, a heart comparable to Rocky Marciano. Extraordinary, his desire to win. You put these brands together and you have a tremendous spectacle. The resume of both men elevates the fight. Let's give another example. Oscar De La Hoya versus Floyd Mayweather. At this time, from what I remember, Oscar was already a legend. He had already reached the top of the mountaintop. Floyd, at the time, was a great fighter. He was climbing the mountain, was already a great champion, but then would go on to do even more things. This was two elite fighters. You had Oscar De La Hoya, who was, I would argue, a global superstar. He was loved, not just by the boxing community, but by the world. And then you had Floyd Mayweather, who brought a great sophistication in defense, but also was a great marketer. He made himself the enemy. You tuned in to watch him lose. Again, two fighters, a great fight with two great resumes. And then you have Larry Holmes versus Ken Norton. This is an important one because if you look at the portfolio of Ken Norton, of course, he beat Muhammad Ali 1 out of 3 fights. So he had that resume, that brand. And then you had Larry Holmes, who at the time, Larry Holmes now is considered a legend, but at the time he was on the come up. But again, you had fighters that had resumes, even though it was different times in their career. So what we can see in those 3 examples is that the resume of a fighter, that can dictate the magnitude of the fight. So when we take Shakur versus Teofimo Lopez, we have 2 great resumes because we have 2 great champions. Of course, we can ask questions like, what's the difference between good, great, and elite? What is that distinction? It's a good question. But what we can say is that we have 2 world champions who, one, Teo, is a world champion in 2 different weight divisions, and Shakur is a world champion in 3 different weight divisions. They bring their credibility, they bring their branding. And this is partly what makes this event significant. This makes this event significant, is their branding and their credibility. So let's address the face-off. First question, are face-offs significant? Are they a good thing or are they a bad thing? Or is face-offs simply just marketing? There's an interesting distinction between a face-off and a press conference, and the distinction is subtle. At a face-off, you sit very close to your opponent. You can see them very clearly. You can smell them. You're in very close proximity. At a press conference, you're at a further distance. Does that make a difference? I think it does. It's a more intimate setting. So the setting of a press conference and the setting of a face-off is different. You know, the face-off is closer. You get close to your opponent. There's less people at a face-off. Is there an argument that face-offs are significant, or are they just simply marketing ploys to stimulate the minds of the boxing purist and the boxing public and the casual fan? Let's take the George Groves Carl Froch fights. The face-offs were definitely great marketing ploys. But the face-off in the first fight was different to the face-off in the second fight. In the first fight, the face-off, George Groves was just winning all the psychological games. He was loquacious, he was funny, he was disrespectful, but in quite a logical way, very condescending. And it was having an impact on Carl Froch. But in the rematch, Carl Froch intelligently utilized his resources and hired a sports psychologist. And then he dominated the face-off. He dictated the terms. He did the quick comebacks. And George Groves looked flabbergasted. Perhaps he was unprepared. It was so easy the first time with regards to the face-offs and the interviews. So to me, in that fight, with regards to the face-offs, there was definitely a significant psychological victory. But did that psychological victory translate to a victory in the ring? That's very hard to ascertain and answer that question. And then you look at the Tyson Fury, Deontay Wilder face-offs, and to me, this was more about marketing. This was more about showmanship. From a personal perspective, I think Deontay Wilder and Tyson Fury did a great job of entertaining the public. This was more about entertainment rather than having any psychological advantage. However, if anyone had a psychological advantage, I think it was probably Tyson Fury. He went from jovial to funny to then really serious and made some very concise points. Tyson Fury is good at doing that. And then, of course, you had the Chris Eubank Jr. and the Conor Benn fight. Again, in the first face-off, there was actually, I think, 3 face-offs, because there was a face-off for the fight that was cancelled, the second face-off for the first fight, and then the third face-off for the second fight. In the first 2 face-offs, respectively, Chris Eubank Jr. dominated it. He had more experience. Of course, he's a very loquacious gentleman, naturally argumentative, but it's coupled with good reasoning. He's good at articulating himself. Ironically, I think both are private school educated, but Conor Benn, he fit the villain role, maybe intentionally. But Chris Eubank Jr., in the first 2 face-offs, he had an advantage. And that was very telling. But in the third face-off, Conor Benn, he pulled a rabbit out the hat. He was logical, he was non-emotional, he was asking questions, he was challenging, he was getting clarification. He brought a sequence of techniques into the third face-off that to me had a little bit of a desired outcome. Similar to George Groves, Chris Eubank Jr. didn't seem as prepared for that final face-off. Perhaps he underestimated the enemy, or perhaps he didn't care. Who knows? Did it play a role in the victory? Again, it's hard to ascertain. Of course, you had the Tyson Fury Klitschko face-off, and I believe that that did play a role, or it could have played a role, because Tyson Fury planted a seed. He looked at Klitschko and told a story, allegedly real, that Klitschko used to outlast all his opponents in camp, in the sauna. He would spend time in the sauna and no one could last with him. And Tyson Fury told a story of competing with Klitschko in the sauna. I believe it was the sauna. It could have been the steam room. And he outlasted Klitschko. And what was the point in that story? Well, the point was he was planting a seed that he had more heart than Klitschko, that he was stronger mentally. Again, did it have an impact on the result? It's hard to qualify. But I definitely think it had some type of psychological impact. And then we had, the Derek Chisora, Dillian White face-off, which is pure entertainment, but with an edge, because both of those warriors will not back down. So with that being said, what was the Shakur Teo face-off like? From my perspective, I like Shakur because he's very direct. He's logical and direct. There's nothing passively aggressive, and he challenges you. He had a very good exchange with Conor Benn, actually. When he was challenged by Conor Benn, Conor Benn, I think, alluded to, like, let's have a fight then. And what Shakur stated was that we're boxers. We're boxers. Why are you talking about that? So he was able to redirect the narrative and gain a dominant position. And I feel that his directness, many people struggle with that. But Teo was indirect. He was not taking ownership of his statements. At a first glance, that can be perceived as negative. However, there was like a passive-aggressive, complex thing about Teo where he was being indirect, but his indirectness was it was almost like a strategy trying to control things. I'm unsure whether Teo is naturally just a very complicated. I'm not sure if Teo is naturally just a very complicated individual, a complex personality, or if he's intentionally just being awkward in the communication as like this passive aggressive tactic to gain control. It was an interesting interaction, and you could make arguments that one got the psychological advantage over the other. For me, I think Shakur was more dominant, but Teo's passiveness and complexity and ambiguousness, is that even a word, ambiguousness, or his ambiguity? He made it an interesting watch, and perhaps that questioned Shakur's assertiveness. It was an interesting interaction. Again, we go back to the initial question. Can you get a psychological edge in face-offs? And if you do get a psychological edge, does it matter? Or is this simply a product of marketing to the general public, to the boxing purists, etc.? So let's address some predictions. Let's start with people that favor Teo. So you have Conor Benn, Sean Porter, and the legendary James Toney. According to James Toney, Teo will be too big, and actually he predicts that he will stop Shakur late. Sean Porter feels that Teo has more different avenues for victory. Conor Benn's assessment is that, it's not a really specific assessment. It's just basically he feels that Teo will win. For Shakur, you have Terence Crawford, Dalton Smith, and Ryan Garcia. Terence Crawford, the great Terence Crawford, who had that magnificent victory against Canelo, is confident of a Shakur victory, very confident. Dalton Smith sees it as a 50-50 fight, but a slight preference on points. And I think Ryan Garcia gives the most interesting take because he says Shakur will win, but he gives a bit more of an analysis. He says that Teo likes to counter and he will have to chase Shakur, and therefore it's the style that's going to present massive problems. Here's a few things to consider. And I was thinking about this. Do any of these fighters have personal experience with these actual boxers? And is that important? Well, if you're friendly with a boxer, you might be less subjective, less objective, and you're more likely to vote for him to win. Alternatively, if you know a boxer, you probably will have more of an understanding of their technique, their camp, and what's going on. So I think the nature of the relationships are important. So for example, I have no idea if James Toney knows Teo, but I don't think he does. So his perspective, if that premise is true, his perspective obviously is from a very knowledgeable perspective, but it's from a distance. Where if you look at the footage, it looks like Shakur and Terence Crawford have some type of relationship. So he's probably closer to the action, so to speak. Now, Ryan Garcia's perspective is the most interesting because he sees a style clash between the two. But again, how close is he to the action? Has he seen Teofimo Lopez fight? Has he been involved with Teo at any capacity? Has he been involved with Shakur? Has he sparred both men? The closer you are can give a good insight into someone if you've been behind the scenes with them, or if you've sparred both of them, so you have more of a direct reference. Of course, there can be variables to fight predictions as well, and we'll talk about that. So, for example, when David Haye fought Tony Bellew, some insiders in hindsight, well, it was exposed in hindsight, actually were aware of David Haye's injury. So when you were making an analysis of David Haye versus Tony Bellew, if you base that analogy on both of them being healthy, that would be incorrect, because in hindsight, we knew that David Haye was injured, or it transpired that David Haye had an injury. So again, the insider context is important. And I think these predictions are quite interesting. I think James Toney offers an interesting insight, and that's the weight disparity. Of course, they'll come in at the same weight, but some fighters are naturally bigger than others. And will Teo be able to, will he be able to make the weight count? That's the important thing. And weight can have a positive effect, whether it's in the clinches, dirty boxing up close, your strength, and particularly the weight of the punches. So it's a weight disparity doesn't automatically qualify you to have an advantage. But if used effectively, a weight disparity or a natural weight disparity can definitely be an advantage. So this is how I see it. So my perception on Teo, my perception on him is that his boxing innovation is elite and his ring IQ is very underrated. And I've gained that understanding recently by analyzing his fights. My perception on Shakur is that he is like a combination of Andre Ward and Floyd Mayweather. Both of them are great fighters. Now, to me, this is going to be a game of effective counterpunching, because both fighters, both boxers are great at counterpunching. So whoever can dictate in this area is going to have an advantage, and it's almost impossible to know who that will be. That's a massive variable. Also, controlling the distance will be important. To me, Shakur wins if he controls the pace, controls the distance, and lands his counter punches. So if he can land the counter punches and keep Teo at range, and when Teo comes in, hit him with counter punches, then that to me is how he wins. And that will be like typically a points victory. But Teo can win if he can outpunch his opponent and either avoid the counter punches or counterpunch the counterpuncher. So that's really important. The other way Teo could win is if it's a close fight, is to do what older fighters used to call a drill. So what you would do is maybe at the beginning of the fight, you might fight intense for the first 30 seconds. And then in the last 30 seconds, you turn up the intensity and you steal the round. So perhaps that could be a good tactic for this fight, because if it's a close fight, if you can do those little drills at the beginning, at the end of the rounds, that's what the judges will remember. So there's loads of things here. The feints will be important. They are both very good at feinting. And Teo is very creative with his feinting. Will Shakur be able to handle the feints? Will Teo be able to handle the southpaw position, the different angles? The nuances of this fight are important. And also the punch creativity is essential, because if you can bring a different punch sequence that can offset your opponent, that could either score a knockdown, enable you to have a significant advantage, even score a knockout, even though a knockout against this type of great opposition would be unlikely. But the punch creativity or some type of strategic innovation that your opponent hasn't trained for, that can be significant. Initially, when this fight was made, I was heavily favoring Shakur, but after looking into Teofimo Lopez, now I'm more seeing this as a 50-50 fight. The variable of this fight, for me, is even though we give the boxing IQ and the speed to Shakur, that premise might be challenged on the night, but they're both elite counterpunchers. So for me, whoever's the better counterpuncher is probably going to be successful. I think this could be a great fight. Okay, so that's it from me. As I've stated previously, I'm trying to build a digital boxing community, and I'm interested in your insights, your questions, and your observations. And I hope you enjoyed the video. And of course, if you want to support, like, and subscribe. Now, if you want to see more videos, click here or click here. And like I said, thank you for your time. Peace.